This is Jilliana Ranicar-Breese, and this is part 2 of my conversation with Terrance in Paris. Now, Terrance, tell me about your heritage. And of course, you've written this book. The picture on the front, you said you're 6 years old.
First grade.
Yeah. So tell me about, go on.
Well, actually,
you start.
The first sentence, the first paragraph in the book will give you a pretty clear picture. I was conceived in Casablanca, transported across the Atlantic in Solange Medina's womb, and born in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, a mere 17 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. So you might say I was French in utero. And
very good.
Quite an interesting life. My mother, Solange Medina, from the Medina of Casablanca, Sephardic Jew, and to kind of paraphrase the movie Casablanca, I think she was looking for an exit visa, and she met my biological father, Thomas Evans, from this. Monongahela was on the banks of the Monongahela River, which in those days was a steel and coal mining community. The river was dotted with these mills and coal mines in the vicinity, and he was a third generation son of a Welsh coal miner. And my grandmother was from either Birmingham or Manchester, England, one of the great industrial centers of England. They met in Toronto, came to this small community, and that's where I arrived. I was born in Newiggle Hospital in 1947, and that marriage lasted about a year and a half. My mother was petite, bada boom, you know, kind of like presaged Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield.
Right.
The likes of
top heavy.
The likes of which had not been seen in that town. My aunt later told me when she was giving birth to her first child, my mother was in the room, and everything in the hospital stopped. Every nurse, every doctor came to get a look at this thing they had never seen before. Anyway, that was my mother, 17 years old, hardly educated, quite primitive in reality, French and Arabic speaker, and that marriage, I said, lasted about a year and a half. At which point my mother went off to Pittsburgh to work at the Carlton House, which was the upscale shishi hotel in Pittsburgh, which is almost oxymoronic because Pittsburgh disappeared at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In those days it was known as the Smoky City from all the coke and the steel mills. Anyway, she was a hat check girl and a cigarette girl and made enough money to kind of keep me up. But I stayed with my grandmother. Pittsburgh was, I said, 17 miles away. About once a month, Mom would show up with gifts in her hand for me. I was scrubbed, cleaned, dressed up. When she left, I could go back to being a typical boy again. But for that moment, I was kind of on stage like a little doll. Anyway, Mom had, and I'm not even sure how this occurred, wound up in Florida, where she met her future husband, Neil Gelenter. And the summer of the photograph that you were seeing here, so in the first grade, I was in a 4-room schoolhouse. Each teacher handled 2 grades, and we had a 12-hole outhouse. So this is 1956 when this photograph was taken. I was taken to New York because on a Greyhound bus with my grandmother to meet my new sister, Candy, who was just born in 1955, summer of 1955, and ostensibly to help my mother out with the birth of the new baby. But there was an agenda, unbeknownst to me, and I'm certain my grandmother was metaphorically making sure that Neil Gelenter was kosher. The plan was to leave me there, but no one told me about it.
Oh,
so
abandoned.
No, I don't look at it that way. I was received with great love and warmth, so I don't look at it as an abandonment. But so she went back to Monongahela, and instead of going back to the next room for the 3rd and 4th grade, I'm now ready to go to PS 198. And I discovered, and at that time Neil was 24 and I was 8. And explains to me that in fact I'm Jewish, a subject that had never been brought up before. I didn't even know what a Jew was. There might have been, in Monongahela, certainly the local men's store, was run by Jews, which is typical in America throughout the small communities. And my mother had a girlfriend named Frenchie, for obvious reasons, who had a dress shop. But I did not know that they were Jewish, or in fact what a Jew was. There were no kids in my school, no one that I knew. I even went to church on Sunday and sang the canon of Protestant hymns because, as you know, I like to sing and I had an audience. But it's explained to me prior to going into the 3rd grade that I was Jewish and that being Jewish might cause me some difficulty. People may not like me because I'm Jewish.
Anti-Semitism.
And I remember the insanity of a 24-year-old child explaining this to an 8-year-old child who's just become his son. Okay, so I'm Jewish. And as Mel Brooks said, it's good to be a Jew, because there were Goldsteins, Silverbergs, Cohens, Beitel Gold teachers. All of a sudden, I very quickly acculturated and assimilated and became, Terrance Gelenter, or in those days, Terry Gelenter, before I
Terrance sounds better.
Well, now it does, yeah. At the time I was Terry. I think Terrance is a little presumptuous for an 8-year-old kid in Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn.
Okay, so you grew up in Brooklyn, which of course is very Jewish as well. Mm-hmm. How did that influence you?
Well, I mean, I think...
Because you had then a different cultural
Sure.
identity.
Well, I think that looking back, I've been very good at not just assimilating, but acculturating to my environment. For example, my wife was from Guadalajara, Mexico, and when we met, I didn't speak a word of Spanish. She didn't speak a word of English, but I very quickly became fluent in Spanish without studying, embraced the culture, the food, and later worked in the Hispanic media business and wrote a weekly movie column under the name of Guillermo Medina. I come to France, and I speak fluent French, and I engage with all manner of restaurateurs, nightclub owners, theater people, performers, actors.
Well, you're never at home, I shouldn't think. Maybe in the morning.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
I never sleep, that's for sure. And so I made myself, in a sense, people always remark that I've only been here for 9 years. They think I've been here forever. So going back to that, I think that I very early on learned how to adapt to what was offered to me. My ex-wife used to think my childhood was somewhat Dickensian, so I went from my grandmother to Myrtle Parfit, lovely woman who raised me from the time I was 5 to 8. Her children had grown. Husband was a coal miner. And my ex-wife used to think that my childhood was Dickensian. But every step of the way, someone loved me. My grandmother, Myrtle Parfit, Neil Gelenter, Ann Furstenberg, his mother, my grandmother. So I was very, very fortunate. And so in that environment, I began to look for things that interested me. I certainly spent a great part of my life
reading,
and certainly it was very important to me to be respected and loved by my grandparents. I think maybe respect even more so at some level, because these were very, very bright intellectual people who, like many people, immigrants at that point, although they were second generation, were enormously self-educated, loved the arts. My grandfather had an opera-trained voice, was a contemporary of Robert Merrill, and were it not for the Depression and the war, very likely would have been an opera singer.
And did he teach you to sing?
Did not teach me to sing.
No.
Singing just came, I'm like a
naturally.
bird. Yeah. But I did have a wonderful experience on my grandmother's 75th birthday. I was in New York, and we were in New Jersey at a club that featured performers from Broadway who were in between gigs. And there was a wonderful old black piano player that knew every song that Gershwin and Porter ever wrote. And my grandfather and I had our arms around each other and did a duet. So, I don't know how many kids can claim that to have occurred.
Wonderful, wonderful.
But my grandfather was in China during the war, had command of about 50,000 Chinese troops, developed an ability to speak several Chinese dialects under Vinegar Joe Stilwell. And we would get great service in Chinese restaurants. And we'd get things that were never on the menu, because he could identify where they were from.
Yeah.
So that was the atmosphere that I grew up in. They were voracious readers, very much aware of politics. Certainly, I think my great-grandmother, who I never met, was a union organizer back in the 20s.
Right.
Tough little Russian lady about this big.
Like a suffragette.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll continue in part 3. Thank you very much, Terrance.
Thank you.